Good evening, everyone. Good evening to those in the room. For those who are joining us online, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case may be. Welcome to our 20th Kelly Bang Annual Lectureship. I'm Paula Rushton. I'm the director of the School of Occupational Therapy. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to take a few moments here at the very beginning to share a little bit with you about Kelly Bang. Then I'm going to invite Dr. Diane McKenzie to invite Amira to begin her presentation. Our lectureship this evening is Amira Tawashy. And then we'll have a short refreshments at the very end. We welcome everyone to stay for a few minutes after the lecture for some chatter and some networking. The Kelly Bang Memorial Lectureship was established by her family in 1999 to honor those whose research, practice, teaching, and advocacy advance opportunities for women and or marginal adults who are learning to live in their communities. The lectureship recognizes the importance of the creative arts in personal and social visions. Kelly Bang was a graduate of Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts, her Bachelor of Arts, and received degrees from Columbia University in New York, that was her certificate in occupational therapy, and St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia for her Master's of Adult Education. Kelly Bang was a nationally known occupational therapist, lecturer, writer, artist, and counselor for survivors of child and sexual abuse. Her occupational therapy career started with positions in New York. Later in Nova Scotia, she worked with the English Street program of Abbey J. Lane Hospital in Halifax, the Recreation Association for the Disabled in Lunenburg, and Bridgewater's Arc Industries, providing sheltered employment for adults with mental and physical disabilities. There she was director from 1980 to 88. Kelly was a longtime volunteer at Second Story Women's Center Bridgewater, and in 1989 she founded Nova Functional Assessments and Therapy Services Limited, based in Lunenburg. Her strong support for Dalhousie's School of Occupational Therapy assisted in the development of the undergraduate program where she was lecturer. We thank Kelly Bang's family for the endowment that supports this lectureship every year. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Diane McKenzie.
Thank you. So we only have one microphone, which is why I'm hovering around everybody.
And we're good friends. So I'm going to read off of here so that I don't miss anything of the spectacular background for Amira. So it is my pleasure to introduce the 2023 Kelly Bang Memorial Lectureship recipient, my colleague and friend, Amira Tawashy. So for those who have been taught or mentored or even know Amira, you will already appreciate the level of energy and engagement she brings to any interaction. What you may not know, though, is that she is a very active volunteer on the global stage. Amira's international work is in marginalized areas and populations extensively draws upon the important role of community together with decolonizing approaches. She is actively involved with the International Society of Wheelchair Professionals, a society that actively advocates that mobility is a human right around the world. Her work has taken her to refugee camps and marginalized communities in Haiti, northern Uganda, Kenya, India, Nepal, the Sudan, just to name a few. More recently, Amira was one of 8 international consultants and the sole North American volunteering in the Ukraine with the World Health Organization, building the Ukrainian model of National Spinal Cord Injury Rehabilitation Center. She's also been back since. She is a sought-after speaker internationally for her innovative work in the development of wheelchair skills training for marginalized and low-resource populations. So, we are both fortunate and very proud to have Amira as a colleague at Dalhousie, and greatly look forward to your lectureship for those both here and online. So I welcome Amira.
Thank you. So thank you. I have a few thank yous. Where'd it go? Oh, sorry. I have a few thank yous before we even start. Obviously, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming tonight. I'd also like to thank Kelly Bang and her family, and Paula gave some extensive information about that, so I probably won't regurgitate it all. But I do want to emphasize that the lectureship did recognize the importance of the creative arts in personal and social visions. I'm not super creative and I'm not very artsy, but I am going to try and do my best with this lecture. I'd also like to thank two previous Kelly Bang lecturers in particular, Karina Valvera is sitting right there, and Rachel Thibault, I think she's listening online. I'll show you throughout the talk where I'm drawing upon some of their thoughts. I'd also like to thank two of my greatest mentors. Dr. Lee Kirby is, if he wants to give everyone a bit of a wave, I'm sure he doesn't. But he's been a big mentor for me here in a lot of my wheelchair work. I'd also like to thank Dr. Janice Ng. She took a chance and hired me back in 2005 when I had the unfortunate circumstance of not getting into physio school. So I will be forever grateful for her, both for hiring me and for me not getting into physio school. So I know she's sitting there listening to this right now thinking, oh dear God, I really hope she starts talking a little bit slower. So I'm going to do my best. I'd also like to acknowledge the resources I drew on from much of this talk. And so I've indicated direct quotes where it's applicable, but I think it would be remiss if I didn't show you these. So the three on your right are books, and then the one on the left is actually a Netflix documentary called The Swimmers. It's not about swimming really at all, but I would really recommend you go and watch that on Netflix if you have a chance. So, as has become traditional in Canada, Dalhousie has a stated land acknowledgement, but I think things are a lot more complicated than just putting this statement up here. So we know colonialism went in multiple directions from the centers of power. So it's obviously not just Canada that feels the effects of this. I do think, though, that people of color, immigrants, and first-generation Canadians may have some unique perspectives about colonialism. So before I go any further, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, just before we get started. So, who am I? I had written on my notes that I was young, but I thought, okay, maybe I'm fairly young. And I'm a temporarily walking female. So the way Catherine Frazee says it is, I walk in that quaint, if somewhat laborious, biped way. I say temporary because any one of us could become a wheelchair user in our lifetime. And so I think it's important to highlight this fact because we currently live in a social order premised in the most fundamental ways upon the assumption that everyone, or everyone who counts, walks. I also think it's important to note that because I'm talking about wheelchairs. And so I think it's fairly prudent to note that any one of us could be a non-walker at any point in time. I'm also a first-generation Canadian. My mother came here from England, and my father came from Syria, and they met here, I'd say, about 50 years ago in British Columbia. Given the atrocities incurred by Indigenous people of Canada due to colonization, I think it's natural to have some mixed feelings towards Britain. And so while there's some varying degrees of emotions on this topic, I hope we can all appreciate that there were some great things to come out of England. Other than just my mother, of course, but people like Elton John, the Beatles, and my personal favorite, the Spice Girls. Syria, on the other hand, though, is a little bit different. That country also skyrocketed to the forefront of the news about 20 years ago. So when I was growing up and people asked where my father was from or where I was from, I would often say Syria. And then everyone said, Siberia? Isn't it really cold there? And I was like, no, Syria. But that's not so much a problem anymore, because now when I say Syria, everyone knows what I'm talking about. So my father immigrated from Syria more than 60 years ago, and although he may have struggled with some of the nuances of being a Canadian, he certainly understood the enormous chance he had in this country. And I was very much raised not to squander my opportunities to be educated, my opportunity to respect the chance to work hard, and my opportunity to give back to those not as fortunate. And so I really cannot express how lucky I feel to be born here in Canada and how connected I feel to this country. And most importantly, I can't emphasize enough how grateful I am to live here, both in freedom and in peace. So now that you know where I come from, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking this evening from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kma'ki First Nation, and so I speak my words tonight, in the spirit of respect and reconciliation. So what am I here to talk about? This is the title of my talk, but I just want to add some qualifiers to it. I am talking about wheelchair provision, but I'll likely talk about some other things as well. The bulk of my talk is going to be about some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. So I'll talk about the wheelchair first, and then I'll go into the rest of it. So working with wheelchairs has been the avenue by which I've been able to travel the world and meet lots of really, really interesting people and do lots of cool things. So it's really become the lens through which I've seen much of the world. We know the wheelchair is one of the most commonly used mobility devices. So we know about 80 million people, or 1% of the world's population, needs a wheelchair. But we know almost 95% of those who need one do not have access to an appropriate chair. Now we know wheelchairs are in particularly limited supply in developing countries. This is for a few reasons. We know production facilities in those countries are often insufficient. We know recycled or donated wheelchairs, so ones that Western or European countries send, often lack parts and services. And we often know that these donations are provided by charity groups. And so the goal of charity groups is often to donate as many as possible, but they're not always that appropriate or of the best quality. And so when I say appropriate, I mean, does the wheelchair work, for example? Does it fit properly? Is it adequate for the user's environment? So are we donating wheelchairs that have really skinny tires when most of the users are going to be outdoors for most of the time? Now we do know that appropriate wheelchairs have a lot of pluses. We know they can increase someone's mobility, they increase usually their potential for education, similarly they increase their chance for work or productivity, and we also know they can increase social life. So it seems super obvious, I think, to most of us, that people or countries who are able to should likely donate appropriate wheelchairs and perhaps send some experienced therapists to provide them. But the literature shows us something a little bit different. And this is one of my favorite studies. I use it quite a bit. But these authors wanted to survey the fate of donated wheelchairs and the difficulties encountered by the users. So they interviewed 162 participants in India, and of note, only 3 of those were female. And they found that the wheelchairs that they were using were a single size, so the typical one size fits no one, rigid, cheap, and locally made with solid tires, which means they're typically pretty heavy, and fixed arm supports. So no matter what size you are, your arms are going to be up here somewhere. And so they had some conclusions once they interviewed these people. They found that 72% of the wheelchairs that had been donated were not used at all. And so they came up, they said there's 3 reasons why they think this is happening. 1, the wheelchairs were being rejected due to pain, fatigue, discomfort, and lack of habitat adaptability. And so what that means essentially is the world is not really built for people who are non-walkers or for those who don't walk. Obviously, that's the same thing as a non-walker. Manual wheelchairs are unsuitable for outdoor mobility due to low speed and high physiological demand. So they don't go very fast and you get pretty tired when you use them. And they also thought that wheelchairs were of little use indoors, as they are difficult to maneuver under the environmental conditions and architectural restraints. So you can imagine a big old clunky wheelchair you're not really getting under your kitchen table. And so this actually does reflect the reality. We know that, as I said before, that many of these under-resourced settings rely on non-governmental organizations or charities to access their wheelchairs. And so we know this, these large organizations started mass distributing wheelchairs in the early 2000s. And their goal was to reach as many people in a short period of time. And as I said before, donations often do not meet the criteria. And so we know that we have inappropriate wheelchairs being donated, and they're also being provided without the associated services. So they're not fitting them appropriately, they're not training their users, and they're not giving any education on what to do if your wheelchair breaks down. And so we know that mass distribution of wheelchairs without these services has many negative consequences: fatigue, discomfort, postural differences, and pressure injuries. We know all of these 4 things will typically lead to wheelchair abandonment, like was noticed in that earlier study. Now, in my personal experience, I noticed the same thing. So I started some of my international work on a couple of mass distribution trips, and these were the tenets of the trip. This is what our team leader was saying. Our main goal is always proper fit. We have no time to spend on anything other than making a chair fit well, which is always our #1 priority. So maybe that's a little bit better than some charity groups because we're focused on fitting. But she also went on to say, you know, we can show the basics. So how to pop a chair up, to go over obstacles, etc. But frankly, that is pretty common sense they figure out pretty quick. And I'm thinking, well, popping up your wheelchair isn't overly common sense. And now I know from looking at most of you, you probably haven't used a wheelchair too often in your lifetime, but we have all learned, most of us learned to use a different mobility device. And I would imagine most of you learned to ride a bike like this, or with training wheels, or a tricycle, but you weren't just thrown on a bike and taught and said, just go for a bike ride. And I actually did some research, and it looks like there's adult beginner bike clinics as well, because they noticed that it's not a little kid problem. Most of us can't just hop on a bike for the first time and be totally fine. And so just like riding a bike, when we ride a bike, we need to know how to turn, we need to know how to go up and down hills, we need to know how to brake so we don't crash into people. Wheelchair users must also possess a variety of wheelchair skills. They need to know how to turn. They need to easily go up and down curbs. They need to navigate hills and ramps. And what we actually know is there's an association between wheelchair skills capacity and mobility, caregiver burden, and social participation. And so what I mean by that is if you have a high wheelchair skills capacity, so you have the ability to do lots of things while using your wheelchair, what we know is you have an increased chance at independent mobility. We typically see decreased caregiver burden, and we also see increased social participation. And so this is where one of my steals from Dr. Kirby comes. I love this slide. So I'm just going to orient you to his scale. And so if you see on the left in green, we have the good things about wheelchairs. Okay? And if you look at the right in red, we have the not so good things about wheelchairs. So we need to be able to tip this scale in the favor of wheelchair users. So we need to be able to increase the good things or facilitate these good things and mitigate some of these bad things. And there's a few ways in which we can do that. We can look at better accessibility. And so that would be like architecture, engineering, all that sort of stuff. We can look at better wheelchair design. And again, that comes from engineering the wheelchair, looking at different ways we can make it more sleek and fast and light. Or we could perhaps look at better wheelchair service delivery. Now, I'm not so good at the first two, but so this is where I've been focusing most of my efforts. And I think most of us think that if we can find a way to do better wheelchair service delivery, we'll be able to tip the scale in the favor of wheelchair users. And so this study takes a look at what happens when training is provided in association with wheelchair provision. The findings from it and others like it support the importance of providing training in the use of the wheelchair. So what they did, they just simply asked almost 150 wheelchair users, did you receive any training on how to use your wheelchair? And if those wheelchair users answered yes, they were 5 times more likely to also report satisfaction with the wheelchair. They were 2 times less likely to report participation restrictions, and they were 3 times more likely to report an improved quality of life. So this provides support for education and training on how to use the wheelchair. And just like riding a bike, it tends to work out pretty well. And so these are the new 2023 WHO guidelines for wheelchair provision, and you can see they divided wheelchair provision into 4 steps. And so training the user on how to use their wheelchair takes up 25% of it. So it's one of the 4 steps. You can see the other 3 are select an appropriate device, fit the wheelchair properly, and the 4th one is follow up and education on maintenance. And so I talk about training a lot, but I'd like you to keep in mind that it's only part of appropriate wheelchair provision. And so there's a coordinated program that's been developed for teaching these 4 steps, and much of my recent work over the past few years has been teaching these guidelines using this program to wheelchair provisioners. And I usually put, or not usually, I always put a real focus on that training for the reasons that I've outlined. And so that's really the majority of the work that I've done with wheelchairs, or where I put my efforts, is that by teaching these guidelines and making sure that we ensure adequate training, teaching of training, the hope is that we can better wheelchair service delivery such that we can tip those scales in the favor of wheelchair users. Okay, so that's just a little bit about wheelchair provision and sort of the background of what I do. The main bulk of this talk was I wanted to tell you a little bit about the things that I've learned along the way. So over the summer, I was thinking of some of the key things that I wanted to discuss. And I came up with these 5 C's. And part of this idea came from a previous Kelly Bang lecture in which Rochelle Thibault talked about her 4 R's of resilience. And Brenda Bagan and I were out for a non-alcoholic beer, and we were talking, okay, what should I title this? And she said, wouldn't it be a great ode to Rochelle Thibault if you go with the same thing, 5 C's of international mentorship? I was like, yeah, that sounds great. So Lil asked, the communications person, she asked, okay, what's your title? So I told her, and she's like, no, that's not very catchy. It's not going to work. I was like, what the heck, man? And so then I was thinking, well, how come Rochelle got to call her talk that? And then it got me thinking that I didn't even know what the R's of resilience were. I just knew there was 4 of them. So there she is. There's Rochelle. And so I just thought, okay, you know what? I'm just going to email her. So I did. I recall your talk entitled The 4 R's of Resilience. However, I don't actually remember what each or any of them are. I'm quite embarrassed to admit that. I mean, obviously I wasn't that embarrassed because that's exactly what I wrote to her. Anyway, she wrote me back very politely with this. And so I believe, it's very polite. I believe you remember the 5 C's of eudaimonic intentional activities. I was like, I don't recall that's what I remember, but okay. But anyway, from her lovely email and a few subsequent Zoom calls later, I learned a few things from Rochelle. The first thing I learned was that she, and may I say she is an Order of Canada recipient, was also not allowed to title her talk using the 5C method, which I thought was the 4R method, but she was not allowed to do that either. And so then I felt like a real loser because I was like, 5 C's, I thought I was being original, but I'm not. So anyway, she also told me to speak from my heart when I gave this presentation. And so that's what I'm doing. The rest of my talk is really just my opinions and my thoughts. So rather than being shaped from the current literature, I'm just going to talk about some of the experiences that I've had. So here are my 5 C's. Take that, Lil. They're there, 5 C's. So I'd like to start with talking about comfortable with being uncomfortable. So there's some easy things that you can have discomfort with. You know, one of my first trips was when I went to Nepal, and I didn't understand the language, and so I just created sticky notes, and you get used to everyone talking around you in a language that it's not like French where you can pick up parts of it. Like Nepal is completely different. I picked up nothing. And so you do get kind of used to that. Over time, technology has helped us out a little bit. So in Ukraine, I did have my own personal translator when I was in Ukraine, but we also have Google Translate, so a lot of us use that. You just type in and it spits out what you want. Other things that I usually am pretty good with, food, for example. My friend Rachel told me when I was in Uganda that I really had to try matoke. She actually said, it's so yummy. And I have a belly of steel, I really do, but I struggled with this matoke. I even took a picture and sent it to her. I'm like, what is this? It's like bananas with peanut butter and some carrots and something. But like a good OT, I find my coping mechanisms. So that's another area where you just... You also need to be comfortable with some different environmental issues. So transport is one I perpetually struggle with. So you can see this is the typical buses in Nepal. You need to decide between whether you want to be nice and free on the top or like smushed down in the middle somewhere. This is how I traveled in Uganda. I white-knuckled it in this thing all the way up to the north of the country. It was just me and the pilot at one point. And I was thinking, my brother would love this, but man, I am petrified. So it was just us two, and I was in the, I was going to say the associate driver's seat, but like the co-pilot seat. And so the wheel was turning when he was turning, and I was thinking, he said, whatever you do, don't touch the wheel. I was like, no, I am not touching the wheel. And then I specifically remember before we landed, he looked at me and he said, "Is anything coming?" And I remember looking, I was like, "No?" And I'm like, that sounds a lot like what my mom says when she's trying to turn left out of Safeway. Like, is anything coming? I was like, no, nothing's coming, buddy. So we landed there. Another thing that you need to get used to in many of these places is the temperature. So it's either freezing cold or boiling hot. And so this is me in Nepal, just casually enjoying my cup of morning coffee. And then I do find that most places I've been are more so the heat than the cold. And that is problematic for one particular reason. The bugs just get me. So this is one of my least favorite animals. This is a cockroach that flies, and it is really only found in all the countries that I've been to. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And so I remember the first night that I was in Haiti, and I was awoken by this thing crawling up my leg, and I was like ready to book my ticket out of there. It was quite awful. So I started chasing it around, and this is a small excerpt out of a text message conversation I had with my friend Cher. But these things are awful, and they continue to haunt me to this day. So no matter where I go, I come armed with battery-operated Christmas lights. I come armed with night lights. I come armed with my own mosquito net. And so it's like me versus those cockroaches everywhere. So that's one reason why I was so excited to go to Ukraine, because they don't have cockroaches there. But the thing about Ukraine, although I didn't feel like I was in cockroach danger, I actually was in real physical danger when I was there. And so that was new for me. And so you can see in this picture up here where the green star is where I was located. You can see where the blue stars are. Those are the troops moving in and out of Kiev. So Kiev's the big city where the airport is. And then the front line is all those red arrows there. And so what's a bit hard to tell in that first picture, but you can see in the second one here, is that Ukraine is divided into oblasts, or they're sort of like our provinces. And so when you're going to Ukraine, you need to sign up for the Air Alert app. So essentially, whenever an air raid siren is going off, the app will let you know. And it's specific to whatever location you're in. So for me, I would always put I was in the Rivne community. And then if there was an air raid siren, your phone would start sirening as well. Sometimes that was completely useless because the air raids are so loud that there's no way that you can really miss them. And everyone prepared me, said, you're going to be prepared for this, be prepared for this. I was like, yeah, I'm prepared for this. I got to Lviv on the very first night that I was there, and I thought, okay, I'll go for a walk. And I'd been out for maybe 45 minutes, and one of those air raid sirens went off, and I almost lost my trousers. It was so loud. And all I could remember was, okay, if you're not near a bomb shelter, you just need to go inside. So I was like, okay, I'm somewhere. So I went inside, and I went into like this booming brewery, and I thought, oh, well, I found my friends here. And I inquired, there was no bomb shelter there. And I texted with the security guy, and he said, well, you're just going to have to sit tight. So I thought, well, could be worse places to sit tight. So that's where I was. And this is just to show you what your phone might look like on any given day when you're in Ukraine. So you can see it goes from the bottom up. It shows, okay, there's an air raid, go to the shelter. And then it'll clear the air raid, and then the air raid will come on again. And then sometimes, this happens every now and then, and apologies, my mother doesn't know this, and I know she's going to be listening to this at some point, but if there has been a civilian casualty at any point, you have to report into another group, and it's essentially just so they know that it's not you. So you can see down here, they ask you, please report your status in the signal group, so you have to text into the signal group and say that you're okay and where you are. So this is kind of like the day life that goes on in Ukraine. I will say, like the bugs in Ukraine and all that sort of stuff, the kind of discomfort you have around that pales in comparison with some of the emotional discomfort that I have when I'm seeing poverty on a scale that is really not seen here in Canada. And so if you look up here, you can see the one, I think it will be your top left, is a hospital in Nepal. And you can see those beds, and then there's little beds actually underneath those beds. And so that's where the caregivers stay. So they pull out the little bed and they sleep down next to the patient's bed. You can see next to that, that's like the food center at one of the refugee camps I was at, where everyone is getting their 1 cup of rice or their 1 cup of beans. And then down below here is a typical house in Haiti. And so the house, that is the house. It's a room like that, and you can see the door is a curtain, and then there's all mold on the wall, and if you're lucky, there might be a little burner off to the side. And so any of the discomfort of the other stuff that I've talked about really pales in comparison to this sort of stuff. And so I think the conversations about why these countries are so poor is quite multifaceted and is really beyond the scope of this. But wherever we go, whenever we go to work in a different place, I think we need to educate ourselves on some of the basic things about their culture and their history. Because this often will tell us, some reasons for their socioeconomic status, which we know is a big factor in their general health. So this is my first steal from Karina, and the second C in terms of culture. And so like I said, regardless of whether, on many of these trips, we pay for ourselves to go. So I need to pay my way. Or perhaps, they pay for me to go, but I have to pay for something else, But regardless of whether we're paying or whether they're paying us, I think we're still guests in this culture. And so we really have to respect that. And so the first thing about culture is we really need to do our homework. And so this is an example when I didn't do my homework. The first trip I went on was to Nepal, and I went to the vaccination clinic, and they said, okay, where are you going? And there was these options, and then I got stuck between Africa and Asia, and I was like, where is Nepal? And as you can see here, it is clearly not in Africa, but I didn't know, so I just, to be safe, checked them both off. Luckily, that meant I got the vaccinations for both countries, because my next few trips were in Africa, like solidly in Africa. And then I went to Haiti as well. And so although these 5 countries are in very different places, they do have some commonalities. And so there's a few things that I'd like to highlight. The first is, in all 4 or 5 of those countries, 90% of the inhabitants live rurally. And I don't mean rural like Antigonish. I mean they live like 2 to 3 days walk from the nearest road. Okay, and they're also subsistence farmers. So that means they eat and they make money from whatever they grow. And that also means that families typically rely heavily on a male's income for their livelihood. Most often people live in a traditional home, and so a traditional home in Nepal, which is in Asia, versus a traditional house in Africa, although they look different, they generally have some similar features. They don't typically have an accessible entrance, there's no indoor water supply, and generally speaking, a little cluster will share a pit toilet. And then when someone sustains an injury or falls, typically they become what we call a non-contributing family member. And what that means is they're not contributing, so they're no longer able to contribute financially to the family, but it also takes another member out of the contribution pool because there's another member who now needs to look after that member. And so what happens in these instances is it will push a family from common poverty into dire destitution because they now have 2 people who cannot financially contribute to the family. And so when we look at the reasons behind these economic struggles, there are some agreed upon factors. We first know that rich nations typically are in temperate, like comfortable temperatures. We don't have those flying cockroaches here in Canada. Whereas 90% of the World Bank defined poor countries are in the tropics. And this has implications for both their food supply and diseases. So we think about some of the diseases you see in Africa. Malaria is a big one, dengue fever is another one. We just don't have to fight against those kind of things here. We know that colonialism and slavery are also both on the list, but the literature shows us that these are not the only causative factors. Rather, governments, typically corrupt and exploitive governments, are what prevent their nations from moving forward economically. And I don't think we have to look much further than the post-earthquake endeavor in Haiti to see this. We know that while many rich countries tried to solve other countries' problems, we know these have been spectacularly unsuccessful. And again, I think when we look at Haiti, it's a prime example of this. And so we really need to do our homework and understand the reasoning behind each country's socioeconomic status because, as I said, that plays a huge role in the nation's overall health. We also need to be patient. So it's no longer a surprise to me that many other languages have developed some super eloquent ways of saying be patient. So this first one is in Haitian, Petit petit oiseau fait niche lit. That just means slowly, slowly the bird builds his nest. And instead of saying slowly, slowly, they rip out this whole expression to you when you ask them a question. The next ones are in Swahili, and then krok za krokom is step by step in Ukrainian, and they use this phrase all the time. Now, I think there's a few reasons for this. We can think about time, and we think about Western views of time. It's quite linear. So we're in the West, to us, like, time is money. So this much time goes by, we get this much money. So we're quite rushed in terms of how we do things. But for some other places, time is a lot more procedural, and so it's based on events. And so, you might think it's not really all that important. But it is when we go to work in these other places, because cultures that measure time by the clock, we're going to expect everyone to be there at a certain time. I mean, even people who come to my class know I start at 9:30, whether you are there or not. But if I go somewhere else, there might be some misunderstandings, because the ideal time for team members to show up may be after they've fed their child breakfast or after they've taken their child to school, and that might not be right at 9:30. And so this can cause quite a bit of tension. Like, one time I was in Nepal, and the bus broke down on the way to work, and we were honestly almost 3 hours late for work. And I thought, okay, we better get to it. But it's customary to have breakfast and tea together, so even though we'd had 3 hours of chat time on the bus, we still had our half an hour of tea time when we got there. So it's very procedural, it's very sequential in terms of you do this, and then you do this. And so there's also some other reasons why we might need to be patient. So in Africa in particular, they love their speeches there. And so you really have to sit tight while they're having their speeches. I think it's very ceremonial for them. So when people come to visit them, they have a lot of ceremony around their speeches. And I will never forget, on one of my first trips, there was a speech, and it had been going on for half an hour, and one of the women just started banging on a wheelchair half an hour in, because she said she didn't have time to listen to the rest of the speech. Lunch breaks, tea breaks, coffee breaks, there's a lot of breaks. People like their breaks, and we used to like our breaks here, I think, back in the 60s and 70s. Now it seems very normal. You just don't take breaks, but in many cultures, taking breaks is mandated. You take your break, you have your lunch, you talk to people. And again, on this same trip, most of the team members, they brought granola bars, they brought whatever, because they didn't have time to stop for lunch. And so that's a huge disrespect and disservice to the women who have cooked for us, all the food that they've paid to bring in. I think when you go, you just have to do what everyone else is doing. And then working hours and days. Working hours and days in other countries is not really so much different than ours. They typically work 5 or 6 days a week, and then they have some time off. But I think, again, when we go, we need to do the same thing. So I had been on a 14-day trip, and everyone wanted to take Sunday off. And the team leaders, I kid you not, the team leader said, I didn't pay to come here for a holiday. So she asked all the locals to come in on work on a Sunday as well. And I think we really need to respect that when we're coming into someone else's country, we're coming into someone else's workplace, we really need to do what they are doing, regardless of whether we've paid to get ourselves there or not. And I think if you do your homework and you're patient, it becomes a little bit easier to be aware of your privilege. This is the last horrific story I'm going to tell you. And I tell you these stories not for the shock value, but just because they've taught me a lot about how not to act. I've learned a lot of how I don't want to be like by viewing people doing things that I really don't like. So these pictures are from a distribution that I did in Uganda back in like 2015, I think. And the way that you get staff to help in Uganda is you just find them on the street. So you pick them up and you take them with you to work. They get paid in cash and they get paid in lunch. So we were working away. Of course, we didn't stop for lunch, kept going. On the way home, we were exhausted. We were all on the bus. There must have been about 20 of us going home. Everyone was really looking forward to like a cold beer and having dinner. But these people hadn't had lunch yet. So the bus driver stopped so the local could pay for lunch and get them some food because it was 5 o'clock. And of course, the line up to get the food was a bit long. And again, I heard these kind of comments. Couldn't they have just packed their own lunch? It's not that hard to pack a lunch. I started packing lunch when I was 8. These people clearly aren't doing their homework. These people get, I don't think in any of those houses there's granola bars kicking around for these people to bring for lunch. So I think it just goes to show again, like, we were going to be, 45 minutes late for our dinner? Like, I think we just really need to be patient and respect and do our privilege when we go to other places. This is another steal from Karina and collaboration. I think we need to recognize that should resources be available, that inhabitants of different settings and countries really do have the wisdom, skills, and abilities to solve their own problems. And Karina was talking about Indigenous people, but I think this rings true to pretty much anyone. And so regardless, again, of whether we've paid for ourselves to go somewhere, whether we're volunteering, whether we're on a paid mission, we are guests in these countries. And so I think we need to be open to the idea of reciprocal learning and taking the lead from Indigenous people, leaders, and communities. So take the lead from people, from the leaders in the places that we're going. And so collaboration has a few different tenets. You do have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable because more often than not, local people have ideas or ways of doing things that are very different from what you're used to. You need to do your homework. Again, you need to understand how things are done and why they are done that way. And you need to be patient. And so people are often anxious when I go places. They want me right away to help them with patients. They want me right away to fit a wheelchair. But the longer I do this kind of work, the more comfortable I am to just going and watching for the first week and just saying, no, I'd like to see how you're doing it. I'd like to see how your pathways go. I really just want to watch you and understand what's going on. And so going back to charities that deliver wheelchairs, this is the quote, no time to spend on anything other than making a chair fit well, which is always our #1 priority. So yes, we do need to teach our wheelchair users how to use their skills, but we also need to teach the locals to do what we're doing. If we're not mentoring the local clinicians on how to fit wheelchairs properly, then they're not going to do any better than they had been before we got there. So I think it's really important to mentor as you go along. You're not just coming in and doing everything yourself. And absolutely, it takes much longer to do things this way, probably triple the time when you're trying to mentor someone, you're trying to fit the wheelchair, you're trying to teach the skills. But if we don't do that, we don't mentor the local people, we are continually leaving people to either depend on us for help or fend for themselves when we go with no further knowledge or resources. So this is a project I worked on in Kenya. This was a wheelchair assembly and repair center. So this was a bit of a more formal approach. This center opened in 2014 and it employed 17 local staff members, 6 of them which were full-time wheelchair users. And so I was sent there for 2 weeks just to help out and do stuff. So as soon as I got there, everyone said, oh, can you see this patient? Can you help me fit this wheelchair? And I was pretty good that by that point I was a bit more seasoned. I said, no, do your thing. I'm just going to watch you for a while. And then we had a meeting at the end of the first week because the thing was the staff were doing a lot of things really well. And I think had I just gone in and done stuff right away, I would never have known what they were doing really well. They obviously needed some help on a few things, but I really wanted to focus on, if I had done all that stuff, I wouldn't have seen their strengths. And so I asked them what they thought, like what do they think they were doing well, where do they think they needed some help? And it turns out that they noted the same things that I noted. They said, you know, we're missing some things. We're not always teaching the skills, and we're certainly not teaching them how to fix their wheelchair if it breaks. And they also said we tend to skip things when we don't know what we're doing. Like all of us, we skip things, we don't really know what we're doing. And so as a group, we generated some ideas of how are we going to fix these problems. So they said, well, maybe let's get one of those big boards and we can write down where everyone's going. And they had the idea of creating these cheat sheets, which I'll show you in a minute, and working in pairs. And so this is an example of the board, and they developed the board all on their own, but you can see there's different, you can't really see, I guess, but each column is a different step. And what they said was some of us are really good at teaching skills, and some of us are really good at fitting the chair. And I here, as an OT working in wheelchair provision, you do all the steps. You do the assessment, you do the interview, you fit the chair, you teach the skills. There they came up with the people who are really good at doing the assessment and the fitting, they're going to do all the fitting. And the people who are really good at teaching the skills, they're going to do the skills. And if they notice something's wrong, then they might send them back to the fitting. And so this created like an accountability kind of flow chart. They also started working in pairs, so they no longer were seeing clients just one-on-one because they decided that if they worked in pairs, it would help them where they were unsure of things. It would also hold them accountable for doing all the steps. And then as a group, we came up with these cheat sheets. So I think in the interest of time, I won't go through the details of these cheat sheets, but we made them about this big, and then for each patient, they just checked things off as they did them. So that's just an example of a more formal form of collaboration where I think it really creates meaningful change rather than just going in there for 2 weeks and just fitting a bunch of the tricky wheelchairs. Clinical reasoning is the fourth thing that I'd like to talk about. And so first of all, what is it and why do we even care? Well, clinical reasoning is our thought process as OTs that guide our practice. And so I want you to think about when you learned how to ride a bike for a second. Think about that, and then also think about maybe if you were to learn how to dance. When you're first learning how to dance, now I wouldn't know because I can't dance, but this is typically what I think you do. You memorize the steps, you focus on your moves independent of your partner, and then I would imagine, should anything change, you're going to get really messed up. You'll have some real difficulties. So beginner OTs are kind of like beginner dancers. When we first start, you're concentrating on the actual steps. You know what assessments are, you know what goals are, you know what interventions are, but you don't really know which goals go with which interventions, and you don't really know which assessments you're supposed to use when. So, if we think about dancers mixing up like the moves of the cha-cha when the waltz starts to play, we can think about beginner clinicians having those same troubles. So for example, if a wheelchair doesn't fit right, there's a lot of different things we can do. We could increase the height of the seat surface. We could lower the foot supports. We could maybe modify the back support. We could maybe change the cushion. And so we know these are all interventions, but as a beginner OT, you might just look at someone and say, ooh, that doesn't look right, but not really know which of those things you're supposed to do. And so, much like if you're learning how to dance, you have difficulty with deciding which moves go with which dances, beginner clinicians often have trouble figuring out which interventions go with which goals or which assessments. And so if we look at clinical reasoning as this sort of flow, starting with number 1 being beginner and number 3 being more senior, we know new therapists fall in this procedural part of clinical reasoning. So they measure knowledge with how much is done. So for example, if I give them a case study with an occupational performance issue, like say I have someone who's got a spinal cord injury who can't feed themselves. They're going to list every single intervention known to man or woman about spinal cord injuries and say, boom, I did it all. It's done. Because they really struggle with knowing which particular intervention goes with which OPI. But these two here are how we move from beginner therapist or entry-level therapist to being a more seasoned veteran. So interactive reasoning guides our therapy. So we know, by the time we hit stage 2, we know which intervention should be used when. And then as we move our way down the list, we can tell conditionally, okay, we can tell right away, that's not looking right, and I can change it kind of on the fly. So why do we care about clinical reasoning? Well, I think most of my colleagues will agree it is literally one of the hardest things to teach our students. One reason for that is that the student will ask you a question and the answer is always, well, it really depends. But clinical reasoning is the backbone of occupational therapy. So without clinical reasoning, we're just doing a bunch of random activities that are chosen for no real purpose. But if we look at healthcare workers in most of these under-resourced settings, most of them have minimal training. So they have a diploma or they have a general community-based rehab training, and many of them are trained on the job. So they just come in at the age of 16 after high school and they're taught what to do. So this makes teaching them very difficult. And if you couple that with the fact that they are seeing some of the most complicated clients that we'll ever see, it makes it really, really difficult. So we are asking untrained people to do the hardest thing about being a therapist, work with these very complicated people. And so this was one of the first things I struggled with on my trip to Nepal. And this is a bit where the other things part of my talk comes in. So when I got to Nepal, I did the usual thing, watched for a while, and then I said, okay, what are you struggling with? Where do you need my help? And they said they need some help with hand management, and these are some pictures. Good thing Karen Landry's not here, but these are some pictures of what the hands were looking like. Now, in general, hand management is one of the trickier things to do after a cervical spinal cord injury. And so what they were doing some things okay, and they were definitely doing some things incorrectly. So they wanted me to give a lecture on it, and so I thought I really wanted to get my ducks in a row before I did that. So I looked up all the literature. I emailed a few people across the country about, okay, what are you doing for hand management? But even in Canada, there's no real consensus about what to do with the hand after cervical spinal cord injury. Okay, so we know management tends to be eclectic. There's no real consensus. There's a variety of splints that are used. The only thing that was clear and came out from all the different centers and from this literature was that clinicians needed to be knowledgeable about the change in physical capacity based on the level of injury as a prerequisite to developing optimal rehab programs. And so that puts us right here in this interactive and conditional part. And so in order to effectively manage the hand, these clinicians were going to have to be at a senior level of clinical reasoning. But we know that they weren't. They were here. And so these are not the individuals who have the background skills to learn clinical reasoning. And I think if we think about people who go to help in these situations, many people are either students on an international placement or new graduates who want the life experience of working abroad. But for all intents and purposes, neither of these cohorts of people are at that senior level of clinical reasoning either. And so this is an Instagram account that I follow. It's a bit incorrect at times. It can be funny, but what this says is what Barbie Savior is saying: who needs a formal education to teach in Africa? Not me. All I need is some chalk and a dose of optimism. It's so sad that they don't have enough trained teachers here. I'm not really trained either, but I'm from the West, so it all works out. Good morning, class. I mean, it's cringeworthy, right? But it is really hard working with these people who are seeing very, very complicated patients. And so when we try to teach clinical reasoning to individuals who don't have the skills and who are seeing very, very complicated people, how do we do it? Well, in Canada here, in our entry-level program, we rely on our students coming in with an undergraduate degree. So they've learned some form of generalization, some academical skills in basic reasoning and critical thinking. And so we use these skills to teach. So we grade our teaching. So the first years here, no, right now you're learning mental health. You're learning the basics of an interview, which is the first part of our assessment. Then you go into MSK, which is a lot more process-based. You know, you break a hip, you don't flex past 90, yada, yada, yada. Once you've done that, then you come into neuro, where we start to layer a bit more complexity on it. And so I think if all of you think to your own experiences, you can think about times where you've learned things where we've made it a little bit easy to start, and then it gets more and more difficult. So this table is right out of the textbook that I use in my neurotherapeutic class right now. And you can see it shows different examples of grading. So for example, when we're looking at jumping rope, first you learn how to jump over the rope once, then you wing it around a bunch of times. That would be grading the activity. If we're learning how to write, first you learn the letters, then you learn your name, and then you're writing a whole paragraph. Okay, so we grade these things. But you cannot do that in the clinical environment when you go to work in Africa or you go to work somewhere where there's underskilled clinicians trying to work with these really, really complicated patients. We've tried to artificially do that in some ways. So this course that I teach, there's a basic level, an intermediate level, and an advanced level. And so we think about the basic level. We just teach people how to measure things, essentially. And the premise of completing this course is that the participants will be able to provide a wheelchair with someone who has just a purely lower extremity injury. So like they've lost a foot, or maybe someone's really quite tired and they need to use a wheelchair part-time. But to go and try and teach this course in Ukraine, where we're seeing people who have come from the front line of war, they are not there with just an amputated foot. And so we have a whole host of additional impairments that we're seeing with these clients, and then we still have this group of underskilled clinicians trying to fit these wheelchairs. And so what do we do when we don't have this luxury of grading our teaching? That really, to me, is the million-dollar question about how we go and teach in these under-resourced settings. For me, what I did when I went and I was trying to tackle this whole hand management problem, I tried to take clinical reasoning right out of it. So we know the nuances of hand management after spinal cord injury are infinite. There's many different things you can do, and they're based on many different things. The severity of the injury, whether there's spasticity, et cetera, et cetera. It's not really a black and white process. But I had to try and make it a black and white process, because otherwise I was really uncertain of how things were going to go. So after about a month, I worked with the staff and we came up with a chart like this. So essentially, I really taught assessment skills. I made sure the staff could assess a grade 1 to 5 muscle strength, and then from there I just laid out for them what they had to do. If it's a grade 1, and I also found some splints and we just divided them into 2. You know, here we make personal splints, there they had a long one or a short one they could pick from. So it was like, okay, if it's a grade 1, you're using the long splint. You're going to use it all the time. You're going to use this stretching protocol, et cetera, et cetera. So it became a flow chart, and so there was no clinical reasoning. We just had to make sure that their assessment was sound. I don't really know if this is the right way or the wrong way, but it's kind of the way that I've settled on for doing much of this work. And then the last thing I want to talk about is compassion. And so, like I said, this is again probably the hardest part of this kind of work. You know, when I was first working as an OT, we were kind of taught that empathy is better than sympathy. And so I went back to Google and thought, okay, can I find these definitions of this? And right, it said empathy is our ability to understand how someone feels, while sympathy is our relief in not having the same problems. But if we look at these people, I don't know if I can really look at them and have empathy. Do I know what it feels like to be in this situation? You know, if I look, the lady on the far left there, she slept on the floor and she had her toes bitten by rats every night because she couldn't move her feet. So I don't know that I can necessarily empathize with that. I don't know what that feels like. And if we think about sympathy, this relief of not having the same problem, I really think most of us cannot begin to imagine a life that is so dramatically different from our own. And so I think it's hard when we think about, you know, we get to the nitty-gritty, is it empathy or is it sympathy? But if we think about compassion, compassion is an emotional response to empathy or sympathy and creates a desire to help. I think we have to be quite careful with this as well. And so I don't know if anyone's heard of this term, but saviorism is the idea that certain privileged groups or people can swoop in to save or to help more marginalized people from their tragic circumstances, much like Savior Barbie, hence the name of her Instagram handle. But this often undermines the knowledges that these marginalized people have as to how their own predicament should be handled. It often overlooks the work that marginalized people do in surviving and supporting one another. And so when we think about marginalized, we can think about people with disabilities. We can think about those experiencing homelessness. We can think about refugees in our own country. And speaking of refugees, one of my now favorite movies of all time, The Swimmers, really brought forth this idea of heroism and humanitarian work. And they were really clear in saying, please don't call humanitarians heroes. So one of the quotes was, the word hero implies that the people doing the rescuing or helping are super special, that they went out of their way to help someone less fortunate and that they should be celebrated. This does not address why the rescuing needs to occur in the first place. And the idea of heroes in humanitarianism really invokes colonial, paternalistic ideas about who rescues and who needs rescuing. And so when we think about compassion in the work that I do, I really think it's an intersection of both saviorism and ableism if we're not careful. A kind of like rescuing disabled people. And so we have to really be sure that we understand this. And I couldn't say it any better than this author, so I'm just going to read it out loud. Disabled people are unique, unusual, and even at times extraordinary. They are not the other, falling short of some unspoken threshold. They are fully human, complete, complex, and undiminished. And yet, how often do we perceive their lives to be diminished or somehow biologically inferior? How often do we intuit suffering, not realizing that our own naive idea about what it means to be normal impose suffering, marginalization, and exclusion? And so I think we have to be very wary that we are not falling into the hole of saviorism and or ableism. We have to not have this feeling that we are rescuing the disabled. I think we need to think about things a little bit differently. Just people helping people. People offering solidarity, skills, and resources to those who need them. Because any suffering or discomfort we might see does not define the essence of any one person. Rather, it is a result of limited opportunities and limited resources. And so while we're doing that, I think we just need to remember that we all come from the same place. And so I'd like to end on this last quote, and my third steal from Karina. We can only go so far before we see a face, our elder cleaning fish, our sister living on the edge of East Vancouver, and hear a voice whispering, "Are you helping us?" So at some point, you might see your mother's face in a woman like this, or you might see your brother's face in a guy like this. And it might make you think a little bit more profoundly about what it is to be human and what your obligations are to others. Thank you. It's 7 o'clock. I think I'm supposed to ask if there's any questions, but I don't think we have time. Thank you. Thank you.
Amira, first,
Here, you can use this.
thank you so much, Amira, for your great presentation, as well as your hard work, commitment, and dedication to our country, Canada, nationally and globally. We all, I think, that are inspired by your work, and we are looking forward to your continued contribution to our community, so that we can have actually a better community. We are looking forward to your continued work, and this is
Thank
actually
you.
a flower from our School of Occupational Therapy, for your hard work.
Thank you.
So this is actually the end of the event, and thank you so much for being here, those who are in person as well as those who are online. We hope to see you again in the next event, and have a great evening, and goodbye. Thank you.